What happens when a single localized metric, a deeply flawed, unexamined executive compensation plan destroys an entire global industry's profitability for 20 straight years?
It's terrifying, honestly, because the answer doesn't lie in the macroeconomics of the market itself.
Right. It lies in the hidden architecture of human decision making
Yeah.
and, how we structurally misinterpret the world around us when the pressure is really on.
Yes. When you examine systemic market collapse, whether it's a regional banking failure or a global supply chain completely freezing up, you almost always find a single unchecked assumption at the root of it.
Just a blind spot.
Exactly. A mathematical blind spot that scales into an absolute catastrophe because nobody in the room knew how to isolate the actual variable that was causing the bleeding.
Welcome to this deep dive into the architecture of elite problem solving. Today, we are extracting insights from a masterclass on case interview frameworks, specifically the methodologies used by top-tier global consultants to untangle massive corporate crises.
And we're looking at sources that break down exactly how to open, analyze, and close complex business problems.
Right, and for you listening, this isn't just about passing a consulting interview at McKinsey or Bain. This is about how power, money, and survival are navigated at the highest levels of global business. The mission of this deep dive is to shortcut your way to thinking like a top-tier global analyst.
We are going to deconstruct the exact mechanics of how to strip away the noise, bypass the panic, and find the structural truth in any chaotic system.
So to start us off, I think we need to talk about what actually happens in a boardroom when things go wrong.
What's fascinating here is that when a crisis hits, whether it's a multinational conglomerate suddenly hemorrhaging cash or a sudden shift in global supply chains that threatens sovereign security, most people instinctively drown in data.
They just panic and ask for everything.
Yes, they look at 50 variables at once. They want more reports, more dashboards, more opinions. But the true power of elite problem solving actually lies in radical simplification.
Stripping it down.
Stripping away the noise to isolate the exact mathematical or contextual driver of a failure. It is about building a structural defense against panic, so that your cognitive processes don't degrade when millions of dollars, or even human lives, are on the line.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because panic is exactly what happens, right? When a company is bleeding cash, and we're talking millions of dollars evaporating by the quarter, how do decision makers avoid panicking and actually structure a response?
Well, the source material we're exploring today argues for a highly disciplined, almost rigid approach at the outset of any problem.
Rigid how?
It starts with the philosophy of strict limitation. The text makes a profound point that runs completely counter to how most academics think. It argues that it's infinitely better to master 3 or 4 frameworks perfectly than to memorize 10 or 15 and get caught off guard trying to select the right one.
Wait, back up. Are you seriously telling me that top-tier global consultants, people who are paid millions of dollars to solve existential corporate crises, only use 3 or 4 frameworks?
That's exactly what I'm saying.
Because, frankly, that sounds dangerously simplistic. If I'm the CEO of a Fortune 500 company paying a firm $10 million for an engagement, I want 50 frameworks. I want a bespoke, highly complex model that justifies the billing rate.
And that instinct right there is exactly why so many executives fail in a crisis environment.
Because they want complexity.
Because complexity is the enemy of execution under extreme pressure. When you are under stress, your cognitive load capacity physically shrinks. Your working memory degrades.
So you literally can't process it all.
Right. If an analyst or a CEO is trying to remember a laundry list of 15 different diagnostic tools, a Porter's 5 forces here, a BCG matrix there, a macroeconomic SWOT analysis, they will paralyze themselves.
I freeze.
They do. The source explicitly states that elite problem solvers use fewer frameworks because there is less debate internally about which one to apply. You lock into a structure immediately. That immediate lock-in stabilizes the situation. It stops the panic because you instantly have a direction to walk in.
You don't have to debate the map, you just start walking.
Precisely. You reduce the friction of getting started.
So from the text, we can define these 4 core categories of frameworks. Let's walk through them in detail, because this really is the architecture of triage. The first one is profitability.
Yes, profitability is the purely mathematical framework. It is the diagnostic starting point for almost everything in corporate analysis.
And it's just pure math.
The formula is universal and immutable. Profit equals revenue minus cost. If a client mentions the profits are in the tank, or costs are out of control, or revenues are down, You instantly deploy this framework. It is mathematically complete.
When you say mathematically complete, you mean there's literally nowhere for the money to hide, right? It's either a revenue problem or a cost problem. There's no secret third door.
Exactly. It forces discipline. If profits are down, people love to start speculating. Oh, maybe it's our new marketing campaign, or maybe the competitors are stealing our market share.
They want a story.
They always want a narrative. But the profitability framework says, stop, let's look at the math. If revenues are perfectly flat, but profits are down, your marketing campaign isn't the issue. Costs have spiked. You just eliminated 50% of the universe of possible problems without needing a single opinion.
Wow. Which naturally begs the question of what to do when you solve the math, but you still don't know the story. That brings us to the second framework, which is the business situation.
Correct. Because profitability tells you what the math is doing, but it does not tell you why it is happening in the real world. The business situation is the contextual framework.
So how does that interact with the math?
You use this when the math is isolated, but the context is missing. For example, let's say your profitability framework reveals that revenues are dropping entirely because your average price per unit has fallen. The math is solved. You know exactly what the numerical lever is. But why are prices falling?
Right. Math can't tell you if a new competitor entered the market or if consumer tastes shifted.
Exactly. Is there a new competitor undercutting you? Has the macro market shifted and your product is now obsolete? Are you entering a new geographic market and mispricing your product because you don't understand local purchasing power?
So it's all about the external factors.
External and internal. It incorporates strategy, customers, the external marketplace, and the company's internal capabilities.
Yeah.
It is the default framework when the problem isn't explicitly mathematical or when the mathematical problem demands a strategic explanation.
Then the third one is mergers and acquisitions, or M&A. And the source notes this is really just a specialized variation of the business situation framework.
It is. M&A triggers when a large entity wants to acquire a smaller one, or when two equals merge. But the crucial analytical split here, and this is where most amateur analysts mess up, is determining the core underlying motive for the acquisition. Why do they actually want to buy this company?
Well, usually it's to grow, right? To get bigger.
That is the surface level answer. But strategically, there are usually two very different drivers. The first is strategic fit, meaning the acquiring company wants a new technology they don't know how to build themselves, or they want a new regional footprint.
Like a U.S. company buying a German company to get instant access to the European Union market.
Exactly. That is strategic. But the second motive is purely to eliminate market capacity.
Explain the mechanics of that, because eliminating market capacity sounds a bit like corporate sabotage. How does buying a company eliminate capacity?
It's a fundamental power play in mature industries. Let's say you operate in the telecom sector. The market is saturated. Everyone who wants a phone already has one.
Right, so growth is basically stagnant.
Yes. If there are 4 major telecom providers, they are constantly engaged in price wars to steal customers from each other. That drives down profitability for everyone. So provider A buys provider D. Not because provider D has great technology and not because they have a great brand. In fact, provider A might immediately shut down provider D's brand entirely.
They just want to take them off the board.
Yes, they buy them to acquire their spectrum rights, their cell towers, and to remove a competitor who was constantly driving prices down. By eliminating that excess capacity and competition, the remaining 3 providers suddenly have more pricing power.
The market consolidates.
The market consolidates and profits go up. Which leads us directly into the fourth and final framework, because understanding capacity is an entirely separate discipline.
Right, supply and demand, the capacity framework.
Precisely. Supply and demand is used to explore macro-level issues around industry capacity. Building a new manufacturing plant, shutting down an aluminum smelter, or, as we just discussed, acquiring a competitor just to take their production off the market.
So it's about physical constraints mostly.
It's highly specific, usually driven by numbers regarding fixed production costs, market contraction, or macroeconomic shifts in how much of a product the world actually needs.
You know, it sounds so incredibly clean when you lay it out like that. 4 buckets. If it's math, use profitability. If it's context, use business situation. If it's buying someone, use M&A. If it's factories and production, use supply and demand.
It should be clean. That's the goal.
But then the source shares this incredible anecdote about a hotshot Harvard MBA bombing what seems like the easiest case imaginable during an interview, the lemonade stand case. You are simply tasked with helping your nephew start a lemonade stand. And the elite analyst in our source admits this is the only case they ever spectacularly bombed.
It is a brilliant, humbling, cautionary tale. Why did an MBA from one of the most prestigious institutions in the world fail to figure out a child's lemonade stand? Because they assumed the simplicity was a trick.
They outsmarted
They
themselves.
brought in outside complexity to validate their own intelligence.
They couldn't just say, well, lemons cost this much and water costs this much.
No, they started building intricate macroeconomic supply and demand curves. They tried to model out complex economic behaviors, elasticity of demand based on ambient temperature fluctuations, competitive game theory against other hypothetical neighborhood children.
For a nephew's lemonade stand.
Exactly. They completely abandoned simple foundational logic because they felt their elite training required a complex, impenetrable answer.
They essentially over-engineered a solution to a problem that just required basic ground-level business context. They tried to build a skyscraper when they just needed to pitch a tent.
Exactly. And in doing so, they failed to use the actual data provided in the case. They ignored the fundamental reality in front of them. The danger of overcomplicating early analysis, whether in an interview or a real boardroom, is that you blind yourself to the structural truth.
You lose sight of the actual problem.
You stop listening to the client, you stop looking at the pure math, and you start listening to your own ego. If you jump straight into complex modeling without first establishing the simple mathematical or situational baseline, your analysis is intellectually bankrupt. It looks impressive on a spreadsheet, but it is totally disconnected from reality.
Let's escalate this, because it's one thing to over-engineer a hypothetical lemonade stand in a sterile interview room. But if profitability is just pure math, and these four frameworks are so logical and stabilizing, why do entire mature multi-billion-dollar industries still collapse?
That's the real question, isn't it?
Let's push past the theory. If the math is so clear, how do executives who are paid to look at this math every day drive their own companies off a cliff?
To understand that, we have to dive deep into the supply and demand framework, specifically looking at high fixed cost dynamics. The mathematical purity of profitability assumes rational actors.
Right.
But structural forces can force rational actors to do highly irrational things. The source uses a primary glaring example of this, which is the United States airline industry.
Yes, the source has this staggering, almost unbelievable quote. The speaker notes that they personally have a higher net worth, even if their net worth was just one single dollar, than the entire U.S. airline industry over a 50-year span.
It is a profound indictment of an entire global sector. Think about that. Decades of engineering marvels, millions of flights, massive global logistics networks, and over a 50-year aggregate, the industry essentially destroyed more wealth than it created.
It's the same.
And the why behind it isn't because airline executives are stupid. It is rooted entirely in structural capacity and fixed costs. In heavy, high fixed cost industries like airlines or aluminum smelting or deep-sea drilling players do bizarre, destructive things just to maintain their capacity.
Let's clearly define what high fixed costs means for you listening, because this is the invisible hand that strangles these companies. High fixed costs mean you have to pay a massive amount of money just to exist, regardless of whether you sell a single unit of your product.
Exactly. The clock is always ticking.
For an airline, you are buying or leasing Boeing and Airbus planes that cost hundreds of millions of dollars. You are paying exorbitant fees for terminal space at major airports. You are paying for massive maintenance facilities, and you have highly unionized salaried pilots and crews. All of that capital is burned before a single passenger even opens their laptop to buy a ticket.
Exactly. Your fixed costs are astronomical. Yeah. But conversely, your variable cost, the actual marginal cost of putting one additional passenger into an empty seat on a plane that is already scheduled to fly, is virtually zero.
Right. It's maybe the cost of a tiny bag of pretzels, a plastic cup of soda, and a fractional splash of jet fuel to account for the passenger's body weight. Let's call it $20.
Exactly. $20 of marginal cost. Now, contrast that dynamic with a low fixed cost, high variable cost business like a boutique consulting firm or a freelance software agency.
Where they just pay people for the hours they work.
Right. If a consulting firm has no clients this month, they simply don't hire freelance consultants. Their costs shrink harmoniously with their revenue. They do not have 50 empty airplanes sitting on a tarmac burning millions of dollars in lease payments. Therefore, a services firm almost never faces a fatal industry-wide supply and demand capacity crisis.
But the airline does, every single day.
The airline does, because the plane is scheduled to fly anyway. If the plane doesn't fly, they lose their gate slot at Heathrow or JFK.
Yeah.
So let's play out the structural trap. It is an hour before the flight. The airline has 20 empty seats. If the ticket normally costs $500 but nobody is buying, what does the airline do?
And they drop the price. Because any money is better than no money.
Precisely. They will sell that $500 seat for $50. Because $50 in revenue minus the $20 marginal cost of the pretzels still yields $30 of contribution margin to help pay down the massive fixed cost of the airplane lease. Rationally, for that specific flight, selling a cheap seat is better than flying an empty seat.
So on a micro level, the math makes perfect sense.
But here is the fatal flaw. When every airline in the industry does this simultaneously, because they all have high fixed costs and they all have empty seats, they systematically destroy the pricing power of the entire market.
Consumers just wait for the fire sale.
Exactly. Consumers learn to just wait for the prices to drop. The airlines engage in a perpetual race to the bottom. They cannibalize their own industry's profitability just to cover the monthly interest payments on their massive debt. They behave completely irrationally in the macro, destroying the sector's wealth because they are trapped by the inescapable math in the micro.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The source transitions from that broad structural flaw of fixed costs into a hyper-specific, real-world example of a 20-year profit bleed. And to me, this is perhaps the most chilling part of the entire deep dive because it shows how one localized anomaly can act like a virus in a global system.
It is a flawless study in hidden incentives and the danger of unverified assumptions. The analyst in the source was called in to work with a client whose business had been bleeding cash for 10 straight years. We're talking about a mature, previously profitable manufacturing industry.
Okay.
But a decade prior, the entire industry's prices had suddenly been slashed in half, and they never recovered.
So this wasn't just the client struggling. The entire industry was operating at half the price they used to.
Correct. The analysts spent a year conducting deep dive diagnostics. They looked at global pricing guides. They looked at market share fluctuations. They analyzed factory capacity, raw material costs, macroeconomic demand curves. Mathematically, it made absolutely zero sense. Demand was stable. Raw material costs were stable. Yet everyone was charging 50% less.
It was essentially an industry-wide pricing suicide pact.
Yes.
And nobody knew why. Not the client's competitors, not the Wall Street market analysts following the sector. Everyone was just living in this depressed reality.
Nobody knew. They had all accepted the depressed prices as the new laws of physics for their market. It wasn't until someone finally nudged the analyst to look away from the macroeconomics and look at a highly localized, deeply buried, almost administrative piece of data.
The executive compensation plan.
Exactly. The specific executive compensation plan of the guy running the business unit at the market-leading competitor 10 years ago.
The dark truth at the bottom of the well. Let's walk through exactly what happened because this is the ultimate aha moment regarding human incentives.
The headquarters of that market-leading competitor wanted to aggressively drive their global market volume. They wanted to be the undisputed heavyweight in market share. So corporate HR changed this single specific executive's bonus structure. Previously, he was bonused on net profits.
Meaning he had to balance revenue and costs to make actual money.
Right. But the new structure changed his massive multi-million-dollar payout to be based entirely on units shipped, volume, regardless of the margin.
So he did exactly what any rational human operating under that incentive structure would do. He optimized for his own paycheck.
He optimized flawlessly for his own survival and enrichment. He hacked prices in half, because when you cut prices by 50%, demand naturally surges. He moved a massive, unprecedented volume of product out the door. He hit all his volume metrics, secured his huge bonus, and likely walked away a year or two later looking like an absolute hero to his immediate superiors, who were only looking at the volume dashboard.
But his competitors didn't know about his bonus structure.
Exactly. This is where the structural collapse occurs. The competitors are sitting in their boardrooms watching the undisputed market leaders suddenly slash prices by 50%. They don't know it's because of one guy's HR compensation package. They assume the market leader knows something they don't.
They must have found a new, incredibly cheap raw material supplier in Asia, or they must have invented a new manufacturing process. If we don't drop our prices to match them right now, we'll lose everything.
Panic. Pure, unadulterated boardroom panic. So the competitors blindly followed suit. They slashed their prices to match. And because the product was largely commoditized, once everyone dropped their prices, the new lower price became the permanent industry standard.
So one executive, simply optimizing for his own year-end bonus, bled all profitability out of a global market ecosystem for 2 decades.
Yes, the industry never recovered its pricing power. A span of 20 years, billions of dollars of potential profit destroyed, all tracing back to one localized, hidden incentive.
It's unbelievable.
This highlights just how incredibly fragile global market ecosystems actually are. We like to think of markets as these rational, self-correcting, omniscient machines, but they are often just a series of blind, panicked reactions to hidden structural incentives. If you do not isolate the true driver of the data, if you don't find the executive bonus plan, you will spend a year analyzing pricing guides when you should be analyzing human greed.
I want to pause the tension here for just a second. If you are finding value in these long-form, step-by-step breakdowns of corporate mechanics of how power, money, and structural incentives actually flow behind closed doors, please take a moment to like this deep dive. It signals to us that you want more of this rigorous, uncompromising analysis, and it helps us continue to deconstruct these global realities for you.
It is vital to understand these mechanics, because if you don't understand the incentive structures driving your industry, you're entirely at the mercy of them.
So what does this all mean for the analyst on the ground? If the data is this deceptive, if an entire global industry can be tricked into a 20-year depression by one guy's bonus plan, how does an analyst actually drill down to the truth without hitting a fatal dead end? How do you navigate this labyrinth of false signals?
You have to build a psychological firewall against your own assumptions. And the source brings up an excellent cognitive trap that top consulting firms use specifically to test candidates on this exact vulnerability. They call it the almost McDonald's trap.
Right. The interviewer will present a case about a hypothetical fast food joint, and they will call it almost McDonald's. And the candidate, trying to be clever, immediately assumes it is actually McDonald's with the serial numbers filed off.
And that is the psychological danger of prior knowledge. The candidate thinks, oh, I know McDonald's. I read an article in the Wall Street Journal that they just ran a massive unprofitable promotion on Big Macs last quarter. So this must be a pricing and promotions problem.
They use outside data.
They use outside, unverified knowledge to guess the answer to the case before doing the math.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, why is guessing so catastrophic? Let me push back on this. In the real world, speed matters. If I am an experienced analyst and my gut tells me it's a pricing problem based on my industry knowledge, and I happen to be right, didn't I just save the client 3 weeks of expensive analysis?
No, because it ruins the structural integrity of the framework, and more importantly, it destroys client trust. Let's play this out in a real boardroom. You stand up and say, I believe this is a pricing problem. If you guess the answer without a rigorously defined step-by-step trail of data to prove it, and the client simply disagrees with you, say the CEO crosses his arms and says, I don't think it's pricing, I think it's our supply chain, you have absolutely no defense.
You have nothing to fall back on.
You have no data to point to. It immediately devolves into a battle of opinions.
And if it's a battle of opinions between a consultant and a CEO...
As the analyst in the source rightly points out, if it's a battle of opinions, the client always wins. It's their company. You must rely purely on the data provided within the closed system of the case or the specific corporate data room.
You have to prove it mathematically.
Step by step, branch by branch.
Yep.
You have to be able to say, it is a pricing problem, and here is the exact mathematical path that proves it cannot be anything else. Otherwise, you are an expert. You are just another loud voice in the room causing chaos.
Which means, if you follow this rigorous path, you are inevitably going to be wrong sometimes during the process. You are going to formulate a hypothesis, test it against the data, and find out the data completely contradicts your assumption.
Yes, and that brings us to the mechanical process of hypothesis testing, or what we can call the art of the dead end. A master analyst does not fear a dead end. They relish it because they use it to violently eliminate variables.
The source gives a great mechanical breakdown of this exact moment. Let's walk through it. Say your client's profits are down by 20%. You hypothesize that revenues have declined, dragging profits down with them. It's a logical assumption. So you ask the data holder, whether that's the interviewer in a case or the CFO in a real engagement, have revenues declined? And the CFO looks at you and says, actually, revenues have increased by 20%.
Most junior people panic right here. Their hypothesis was dead wrong. The numbers seem contradictory on their face. How in the world can profits drop 20% if revenues are simultaneously up 20%? It feels like the math is broken. But the framework protects you from panic.
Because the formula is absolute. Profit equals revenue minus cost.
Exactly. You acknowledge out loud that the hypothesis is wrong. You state calmly, that is fascinating. Revenues have increased by 20%, yet profits have declined by 20%. Therefore, mathematically, this cannot be a revenue generation problem.
You just killed that branch of the tree.
You travel back up the tree to your original starting point, and you seamlessly pivot to the cost side. You state, because revenues are up and profits are down, this must mean costs have gone up significantly, outpacing the revenue growth. Let's examine the cost structure.
You didn't panic. You just used a failed hypothesis to eliminate 50% of the universe of potential problems in 2 questions. It's an aggressive process of systematic elimination. But even when you're on the right branch of the tree, let's say you know for a fact it is a cost problem, the data can still lie to you if you look at it through the wrong lens.
Very true.
And the source spends a significant amount of time discussing why mathematical completeness drives people nuts. But solving 80% of the problem is actually the highest and best use of a consultant's time. This is the 80-20 rule in action.
The Pareto principle. In business triage, perfection is the absolute enemy of survival. Let's say profits are down by $10 million. You dig into the cost structure, and you find that $8 million of that loss is coming from a sudden, massive spike in the cost of a specific raw material, say, industrial aluminum. You stop looking for the other $2 million.
Wait, you just ignore $2 million of losses?
Temporarily, yes. You focus all your resources, all your political capital, and all your strategic thinking on fixing the aluminum contract. People who are obsessed with mathematical completeness, usually fresh graduates who are used to getting 100% on their exams, will waste 3 weeks trying to tie out every last penny across 50 different departments to find that missing $2 million.
While the company is burning.
Meanwhile, the core artery is severed, and the company bleeds to death. You must find what is driving the bulk of the problem and attack it with overwhelming force.
And to find that 80%, to find that core severed artery, you have to understand the danger of how data is usually presented. And the source makes a bold claim: averages are deadly.
Averages are the most dangerous lie in business data. They exist to comfort executives, not to reveal the truth.
Explain that mechanism, because we look at averages all the time. Everyone does. Average revenue per user, average annual growth rate, average daily active users. It's how Wall Street measures success.
Averages hide the rot. Let's look at a hyper-specific example. Let's say a global company's total sales look completely flat year over year, 0% growth. An amateur analyst looks at that average, shrugs, and says, okay, revenues are perfectly stable, the problem must be on the cost side. But a master analyst inherently distrusts a flat average. They segment that number. They break it apart with a hammer. They ask, what discrete components comprise this total sales number?
Region, distribution channel, customer demographic.
Exactly. You segment by geography. And suddenly, beneath that 0% average, you see a terrifying reality. You see that sales in Asia are actually up 20%, but sales in Europe are down 20%. When combined, they average out to a comforting 0.
But you don't have a stable company.
You actually have 2 massive critical situations on your hands that demand totally different responses.
Because if you just looked at the average, you'd do nothing.
Exactly. But by segmenting, you realize you have a wildly successful Asian expansion that is probably starved for cash and needs more capital investment immediately to capture market share. And simultaneously, you have a total structural collapse in Europe that is silently destroying the company's legacy base. If you relied on the average, you would misallocate capital in Asia, and you would let Europe burn to the ground. You must aggressively segment and isolate the data until it confesses the truth.
And when you finally find that isolated point of failure, let's say you've segmented the data and found that localized 20% drop in Europe, you have to ask what the source calls the 2 golden questions. Because finding the bad data point is only half the battle. You have to contextualize it.
Yes. Whenever you isolate a metric that has gone bad, you never immediately assume it's the company's fault. Internal execution is only one variable. You must establish macro context. Golden question number 1 is this a company-specific issue or an industry-wide market issue?
Meaning, how are the competitors doing in Europe?
Precisely. If your sales in Europe are down 20%, and you look at the macro data and discover that all your major competitors' sales in Europe are also down 20%, you have a market contraction, macroeconomic event. Maybe European regulators just passed a massive new tariff, or there is a localized recession. You cannot solve a macroeconomic market contraction by firing your European sales director and yelling at the sales team.
It's a
structural reality.
Right. But if the European market is growing by 5% and only your sales are down 20%...
Then you have an execution failure. Your product is failing or your team is failing. You solve those two problems entirely differently.
One requires a strategic pivot, the other requires operational discipline. And golden question number two.
What is the historical trend line? Where were we on this specific metric this year, last year, the year before, and 3 years ago? You are looking for the velocity and acceleration of the problem. Is this a sudden, violent shock to the system caused by a one-off event? Or is it a slow, grinding, 10-year bleed like the executive compensation plan example we discussed earlier? The trend line tells you how much time you have before the system totally collapses.
This analysis is fascinating. Pulling apart these Lego blocks, avoiding the almost McDonald's trap, segmenting the averages to find the hidden rot in Europe, discovering the terrible compensation plan. But let's face reality, gathering and analyzing data at this level is incredibly expensive. It is counted in days and weeks, and consulting days cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. At some point, the analysis has to stop.
It absolutely has to stop.
At some point, you have to transition from analyzing the problem to actually standing in front of the CEO and telling them what to do. How do you convert this massive pile of analysis into boardroom power?
This is the hardest transition for any analyst. And frankly, it is the transition that defines the future trajectory of their career. Many brilliant analysts get stuck here and never make partner. You have to move from analysis to synthesis.
Define the exact difference between those two for us.
Analysis is tearing the Lego blocks apart. It is breaking the complex company down into revenues, costs, regions, and discrete products to find the hidden truth. But you cannot present a CEO with a pile of torn-apart Legos. They don't have the time or the cognitive bandwidth to put it together. Synthesis is taking those isolated truths, selecting only the ones that matter, and building a house out of them.
So it's about building a narrative.
It is putting the data back together to form a coherent, undeniable narrative so the client can make sense of it and take immediate, decisive action.
This raises an important question. How do you communicate high-stakes data when the house is literally burning down? Because we've all been in corporate meetings where someone clearly has all the right data.
Yeah.
They did the analysis perfectly, but they present it so poorly, so chronologically, that the executives tune out, arguments break out, and nothing gets done.
The source introduces a structural communication framework designed to solve exactly this. It's called the pyramid principle, developed by Barbara Minto at McKinsey. It is considered the gold standard for executive communication globally.
And it changes how you spook, right?
It dictates a very unnatural way of speaking. It demands that you must state the definitive conclusion first, not at the end of a long buildup. First. Then you support it with 3, and only 3, mutually exclusive core elements of data, and you demand a definitive action.
The source illustrates this beautifully with the burning house analogy. The expert in the source imagines 3 different scenarios of someone trying to communicate to a homeowner that their house is currently on fire. Let's act this out a bit and deeply analyze the psychology of each, because the structure of the communication literally dictates the survival of the people inside.
Absolutely. Scenario 1 is what we call a poor close. It is the psychological equivalent of the youngest child in the family discovering the fire.
Right. The youngest child comes running into the living room, rambling in panic. "Daddy, it was an accident. My sister made me do it. I know candles are bad. I told her matches are bad. She pushed me. I'm coughing. It's hot in there."
Well, what is the result of that communication? Complete chaos. There is actually a massive amount of highly relevant data in that statement. Candles, matches, coughing, heat. But there is no conclusion, and there is no recommended action.
The listener is just overwhelmed.
The listener, the father, or in our case, the CEO, has to synthesize the data themselves while in a state of sudden panic. Their amygdala is firing, they are in fight or flight, and you are forcing their exhausted brain to piece together a puzzle. This is how most inexperienced analysts present data. They just dump all their chronological research on the table to prove how hard they worked. First, we looked at revenues, and we interviewed the European team, then we looked at costs. The executive is completely lost.
Yeah. Then we have scenario 2, the good close. This is the older child. They burst into the room and shout, "The house is on fire, let's get out."
This is significantly better. It has a clear conclusion, the house is on fire, and a clear action, let's get out. The result is immediate action. But in a complex corporate environment, this lacks rigorous backing. If a consultant or a VP is telling a CEO to abandon a billion-dollar European market, the CEO needs more than just someone shouting that it's a disaster.
They'll want to verify it.
They need undeniable proof. Without the proof, the CEO might say, "Let me go look at the fire myself," which wastes precious time.
Which brings us to scenario 3, the great close. The consultant babysitter. Let's really break down why this works on a neurological level for a panicked executive.
This is a masterclass on the pyramid principle. The babysitter walks into the room, calm and authoritative, and states the conclusion immediately. The house is burning to the ground. It absolutely cannot be saved. We must leave now.
Conclusion and action right up front. The executive knows exactly what the stakes are immediately.
Then comes the synthesis of the data to shut down any debate. Support point 1. The fire is consuming 10 feet of the hallway every 5 seconds. The house is 120 feet wide. Therefore, mathematically, we have exactly 60 seconds to live.
Pure, mathematically sound velocity. You've established the trend line and the timeline. There's no arguing with that math.
Exactly. Support point 2. The only fire extinguisher is out of reach at the opposite end of the house, and I've watched you work out. You are too slow on the treadmill to make it there and back.
That is a brutally honest capability assessment.
It is essential. You are assessing the internal resources of the client, looking at their actual capabilities and finding them objectively insufficient to fight the macro problem. You cannot outrun the fire. And finally, support point 3. You promised your wife you would protect the kids tonight. If you try to play hero, fight the fire, and fail, she will kill you.
Stakeholder analysis, you figured out what the CEO actually cares about.
Yes. You align the raw data with the ultimate stakeholders' hidden incentives. You tie the macro crisis to their personal survival. And then, having delivered those 3 mutually exclusive pillars of support, you reiterate the action. Get out immediately.
It's an airtight argument.
This is true synthesis. It takes environmental data, physical capability, and stakeholder incentives, and forces an undeniable decision. There is no room for the CEO to debate. Those who master this level of synthesis will essentially control the flow of capital and corporate strategy over the next 10 to 20 years. Because in a world drowning in an absolute sea of data, the person who can build a house out of the blogs holds all the power.
I want to hear from you listening. What is the burning house in your specific industry right now that leaders are completely ignoring simply because the data is being poorly communicated or hidden behind a comforting average? Drop it in the comments. Let's stimulate some real debate on this. And if you are committed to understanding these global mechanics, if you want to know how the invisible systems of the world actually operate, make sure you subscribe for future deep dives.
The ability to accurately synthesize reality is the ultimate competitive advantage in the modern economy.
We've covered a massive amount of ground today. We've seen how a single, localized, misaligned executive bonus structure can invisibly bleed an entire global industry dry for 20 years. We've seen how a failure to rigorously segment data can hide a catastrophic regional collapse in Europe beneath a comforting global average. And we've learned that presenting data without a structural conclusion first is just adding noise to a burning room. As you leave this deep dive, look at your own organization or your field of study. If analysis is pulling things apart and synthesis is putting them back together, what crucial piece of data is your industry currently misinterpreting because they are stubbornly looking at the average instead of aggressively isolating the truth? Until next time.